This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I first saw my guest today on a great TED Talk. Not live, but I caught it online. Didier Sornette is professor on the Chair of Entrepreneurial Risks at ETH Zurich. He has worked on the King effect, a theory used to predict economic bubbles. He has also set up the Financial Crisis Observatory. Didier brings yet another perspective on one of my passions, economic bubbles. He forces an alternative way to think about the unexpected, to think about what comes next. He believes there's a way to see ahead. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Didier Sornette. What was the trigger moment in your life? When did it happen? What year? What was the moment that said, my fascination, one of my fascinations, you've got a wide academic career, but you do have this clear fascination with economic bubbles. How did that start? What was the trigger moment that said, I'm going this direction?
It started with a fascination with understanding and predicting rupture, failures, crises, catastrophes, not in economics or finance, but I started with, actually, I remember it was in 1989. I got a contract. So I was a successful recipient of a quite large grant from EADS, which is the large European consortium building the Ariane space rocket. They had this program asking for companies and universities to try to find a solution for solving the problem of predicting on the basis of recording what is called acoustic emissions, these tiny earthquakes that you can record when a mechanical structure is stressed progressively. It's a bit like your car, which starts to emit some noise. Progressively, you know that you have to go to the garage, to maintenance, to fix the problem. So here they had this recording, and they wanted to be sure that what they fly in space would not blow up. And so I came up with this idea that was successful in their eyes. So they grant me these grants to study this. And the key idea was to develop collective analysis of all the behavior of this acoustic emission. The field has been in mechanical engineering to look at each of these damage event one by one, this acoustic emission one by one, and so on, and to classify them and so on. But the trees were hiding the forest. And my contribution was to say, well, let's look at the forest, let's aggregate the signals. And I discovered even in the pre-proposal data analysis that led for me to be the winner, I could already show that there was a very significant signal, and actually came up with some relatively reliable predictive scheme. So that we developed later on with the software, we got a patent with them and so on. This led progressively to the perception, or to the recognition that in many other fields, not just Ariane rockets and mechanical engineering, there is this phenomenon which I call now a slow maturation towards an instability, whereby a system goes to a crisis or exhibit a big crisis, a catastrophe, a crash, whatever it is in different fields, not out of the blue, but through this maturation, through this progressive damage, let's say mechanical engineering, or this progressive cooperative behavior of many elements combining together through positive feedback and so on. So in 1995, the idea of looking at financial markets with the same type of spectacle, same type of tools came quite naturally because of the wealth of data and, of course, the Asian crisis, which have been in full-fledged and full force. So it came naturally as, having a hammer, a new way of looking at the stars through a new telescope, and wanting to apply to see and to test whether it could be useful.
Let me generalize for the audience, just from my perspective, and we're going to tear this apart a lot more. But I guess in 2003, 2004 in America, if you could get a mortgage from Washington Mutual with basically almost no supporting documents, and they would let you borrow $1 million to buy a second or third home, that's in 2003, 2004. I guess that starts to be some of those early signals that, 2008 didn't just come out of the clear blue.
Correct. Very correct. Actually, when we were analyzing the real estate market in the US, we started in 2003. And as you said, it started around that time. So the signal for our methodology were a bit too early. We were not within really statistical significant evidence. But 1 or 2 years later, in 2005, it became quite clear, and I wrote a paper that we put in the International Archive, Scientific Archive, clearly concluding that we had a very neat diagnostic of a bubble state in real estate in the US, in the real estate market in the US, which indeed, followed this typical positive feedback phenomenon with a buildup of all these signals, all those trees combining in the forest, telling us that there's a big conflagration of fire that is going to happen.
Let me let you explain how this started to become, as you call, a Financial Crisis Observatory. Talk about the genesis there, because I've got a lot of questions to ask inside of that concept, but I think you should define your world as being involved in this Financial Crisis Observatory right now. Define that first.
So I decided to found this Financial Crisis Observatory in August 2008, essentially, I would say, as a psychological response or defense against what I felt, how could I say, a disgust to the discourse at the time, which, did not have the hindsight or all the result of the analysis that came and developed later on, where if you may remember in summer 2008, then you had the Lehman Brothers collapse in 15 September 2008 and so on. Essentially, people didn't have really a clear view what was happening. But what was striking to me was the fact that it was taking most pundits, at the highest level of the central bank, of the treasury of the US and so on, foreigners all over the world and so on, were saying, wow, it's so surprising, so shocking, and so on. And to me, it was so obvious, so natural that such a crisis was there. Of course, there is no way I could not say anything about the details of the sequence of the events, which has a lot of idiosyncratic characters and so on. But so I decided that, okay, we need to do something to provide a tool to go from what I call armchair type of discussion. We just have opinions. While in contrast, as a scientist, I want to have evidence-based analysis, evidence-based discussions to progress. So I said, okay, to myself, I have significant resources here in Zurich, at ETH Zurich. So let's try to do something concretely to inform better and better, and to try to monitor the market, to monitor tens of thousands of equities, of assets worldwide on a daily basis, and to start developing methodology by which we will not have just opinions, but we have evidence base of the development of potential overheating markets.
One of the things that you have developed is a theory, and I would love for you to compare and contrast this, but you call it Dragon Kings. Many people in my audience are going to be familiar with the concept of a black swan, these unknowable, unpredictable events that hit us. And I think generally most people think that's true. They think the logic behind that is true. You've picked a point here, a point of distinction, haven't you?
Yes, indeed. It's more maybe than just the point of distinction. I consider by the way, black swan is just the modern rephrasing of what is called Knightian uncertainty, after Professor Knight in 1923, I believe, introduced this concept of the unknowable unknown. I think that this black swan concept is wrong, and let me be blunt, wrong, dangerous, and irresponsible. Because essentially, it, like Ponce Pilate, with Jesus. Well, you can wash your hands and say, it's not my fault. There's no responsibility. It came out of the blue. It's a crisis that is a surprise. It should not happen. It's an exogenous event. While all the research that our group and others have done point more and more to the evidence that, as I said before, crises, catastrophes, and so on do not come as a surprise if you know how to look to the symptoms. It is, just to take another example, which may be surprising, we are in a society where, medical health costs are skyrocketing, and in particular cancer is really the horrific outcome of many of the life of our lives and so on. And it's often taken for granted that cancer is kind of exogenous, it's a bad luck. Oh, you have a friend telling you, I just was diagnosed by cancer. But actually, we know now enormous amount of evidence show that 98% of the cancers are environmental, and they develop through a progressive, rather well-known, well-documented process while you are typically exhibiting inflammatory response of your immune system that then translate after a decade or so into chronic disease of various types and so on, and which are all favorable catalyses for the development of various cancer. So if you know, the general idea of the Dragon King is that the extreme events, so there are two ideas behind Dragon King. Extreme events are of a league of their own. So Dragon King has two terms. King, which is a special person in a country, which has he is an outlier. His family is an outlier in the wealth distribution, which is usually called Zipf's law or Pareto distribution. So it's a unique person, a unique specimen. And a dragon means of unique origin, not only of unique characteristic or traits, but also of your origin, which means that the Dragon King is knowable, because you can identify weak signals, global signals, and these actually are the difficulties in identifying Dragon King, because they are weak, they are global, they are spread over. So it means you need to know where to look at and to aggregate. Again, coming back to your previous question on the Ariane space rocket and how I came up with being interested in bubbles, you have to look at how to aggregate all these diverse and very complex set of information into a coherent picture. So Dragon King is really the antinomy of black swans. My proposition, my hypothesis, and I think I see a lot of evidence of this when you look carefully, is that most big problems, as well as big successes, because also these upside risks, do not come as a surprise for those who know how to see.
I'm looking at some of your language just to bounce it back at you, and we kind of have that give and take. But I'm reading you say, okay, Dragon Kings, they're outliers. They're generated by specific mechanisms that may make them predictable, perhaps controllable. So when I see the words like may or perhaps, and then I think of something like, okay, then I start to think about timing. How does one use the information? And I'm going to let you explain as much as you can, or much as you want, I should say. But timing issues, because if you're a government or a policymaker, that becomes one issue. If you're a trader or a hedge fund, the timing issues need to be a lot more precise with money on the line. Why don't you talk about that? So when I'm seeing that language of may and perhaps controllable, but then again, you are very clearly saying, hey, hold on, these things are knowable and they are predictable. Clear up my confusion for me and the audience.
Yes, that's the curse of scientists. A scientist has no faith or no conviction and sees the whole world in gray tones. There's no white or black or yes and no. That's why the may is always, when you want to write a scientific article reporting to your peers, you always have to say may, and perhaps to just keep open the door for the contradiction and the fact that there is no absolute truth in science, simply progress towards better enlightenment, better knowledge, better evidence-based models. So that's what the may and the perhaps are there. And of course, for those who are not scientists, and especially our legal colleagues, the lawyers and so on, this is a fantastic opening to exploit this may and perhaps as a signature of lack of evidence, which is exactly the contrary, because science is a dynamical process. So yeah, to clarify maybe that I still say may and perhaps, because of course also there's another dimension. What I just said about the Dragon Kings and so on, the predictability, there's significant variability depending on what type of system you are dealing with. For example, if I go back to my example of material science and prediction of the rupture of, let's say, a pressure tank, which is made of titanium with carbon fibers wrapped around it, I would say with much larger confidence, 95% confidence, 99% confidence, that indeed in many cases I will be able to predict the rupture with some precision and so on, with all the qualifiers. If you go to a very much softer problem, which is to ask what is going to happen in the Middle East politically, then, I'm not working on this specifically, but colleagues have shown some predictability with a number of techniques. And then, of course, the level of the quality of the prediction is much worse, right? But still is some predictability. So that's why there's a whole spectrum of quality of prediction. Now, in terms of time scales, you mentioned a very big issue, of course. As you said correctly, it depends a lot on the application. If you're a hedge fund as opposed to a policymaker and so on. I would go even further by saying it depends on what is the choice of the society you have in mind. Let me give this following example. You could imagine to have a society where the policymaker, the central banks, act to really burst any bubble as soon as there is evidence or some maybe possible diagnostic of some bubble. What would be the consequence? Well, it's very likely that this stock market will be not earning what we are used to, like 10, 15% a year, long term, and so on, but will be much flatter, much less investment opportunities, and probably will not provide to the new entrepreneurs the funding that they need in order to take the risks that they take in order to explore widely the innovation landscape. So there are actually a lot of models that go in this direction, confirm this conclusion that, you cannot have your cake and eat it too. Either you conceive of a society that has a lot of bubbles, which if they are not financial bubbles, I have this theory which I call the social bubble hypothesis. Always as a scientist, I'm cautious. I'm saying hypothesis, but I think we have a lot of facts suggesting that it holds a lot of virtue, a lot of value, suggesting that indeed mankind has progressed in its quest for knowledge and for technical innovation by taking collectively big risks, throwing through the window the cost-benefit analysis. And I'm thinking, for example, of the railway boom in 1840 in the UK or 1870 in the US. Or I'm thinking of the Apollo project in the US or the Human Genome Mapping project or the dot-com internet bubble and so on. All these cases illustrate the fact that at that time, there was an extraordinary exuberance of capital funding so many projects which floundered, which failed, leading to a lot of loss by most venture capitalists and investors short term. But for the benefit of the society, a decade or two later, while the reuse of the human capital that has been built up, the capacity, the technology, and so on, has been later on, for 1 or 2 decades later, reused. So I think that, it's more deeply when you think about the time scale and about what type of society you have in mind. It's a matter of whether you want to promote technology innovation, invention, knowledge acquisition, which always have to come with big risk taking.
Adding to what you're saying and to kind of give the audience a flavor for how this slow maturation process can happen. You had an example in some of your writing. You said, okay, year 1, let's just say this is stock market. Year 1, 5%, year 2, 10%, year 3, 20%, year 4, 40%. Anybody with a pulse that still is alive starts to realize that this is looking a little unstable and a little not sustainable over time. And you might say to yourself, well, Mike, Didier, that's just some kind of example in a paper. But I think back to 1995, 1996, there was good stock market returns. And then all of a sudden the NASDAQ pops off almost 100% in 1999. How in the world could any of us in hindsight have been surprised that there was a collapse? It's this super exponential growth that you're talking about. And I guess what your work is driving at is like, hey, there's these signs and these steps and these things we can see ahead of time.
Yes. As you said, the key word is hindsight. In hindsight, everything is clear. But when you are at the heat of the exuberance, I think there are several mechanisms that help explain why this continues. One is what can be called the new economy syndrome. In 1929, I think the front page of the Wall Street Journal had this new economy concept saying, well, the utilities, telephone, electricity, cars are going to revolutionize the way the market function, the economy function, and the old laws of accounting should be revised. And actually, the prices are not that high in the market. At the peak of the bubble, they are even low. And, you may remember Fisher famously said, I expect in the next few months at the peak of the bubble that the market will get another 30%, and then the next day it crashed. So the new economic concept is also something that was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in 1962 at the time of the tronic boom. The same type of story, the transistor is going to revolutionize, and the type of valuation that are standardly used should be revised in the face of this new economy. And of course, I don't need to remind you that in 1999, same thing, new economy with the internet, the virtual worlds, that they open the new wild, wild west with extraordinary opportunities requires a new way of valuing these companies. And you may remember that there were some companies which has negative price over earning ratio and were priced in the billions. And you may remember also that one of the justifications that were brought is the introduction of the fantastic tool in one way, but also it's a kind of weapon of mass destruction on the other side, which is the concept of real options. To value, to add to the standard discounted cash flow calculation to value a company, the idea that you should add the value of the option that is embedded in the company, because just having a .com in, selling product for dogs is giving you potentially the opportunity to gain if something you don't know what is going to happen on the upside. In hindsight, it's very easy to rationalize that it was madness, but it's really amusing, interesting to see that at the time of the exuberance, you have all these new theories of valuation that become very fashionable and makes a lot of sense. So much so that actually using real option now is more and more fashionable and used by companies in order to price in the goodwill, something which is very difficult to price usually, or the potential scenario that are opened by new investment opportunities. So yes, you're right that if you take a backseat view and analyze this example, 5%, 10%, 20%, 40%, and so on, which I would stress to the person who are listening to us, that this is really super exponential. Simply why? Because it means the return itself is growing. And we should remember that a constant rate of return, it's a 10% a year, that is true the next year, 10% the following year, and so on, give rise to an exponential growth by what we call the law of compounding interest, right? You have a capital of 100, 10% gives you 110 the next year. But because the 10% works now on not 100, but 100 on 110, which is a higher capital, which add the interest to your previous capital, of course, the 10% will give you 11 to add the following year to this 110, you have 120, and then of course you get away faster and faster away from the linear addition of this 10 and this give rise to the exponential. So very important to realize that everything in economics, in finance, in demographics is exponentially growing if the rate of growth of the return is constant. The super exponential diagnostic is that the rate of return, the return itself is growing 5, 10, 20, 40%, which is indeed intuitively unsustainable. As you said, mathematically, you can show that very generally it gives rise to a mathematical monster, which is called a finite time singularity, like a black hole forming in finite time, telling you not that the universe is going to disappear or blow up and explode like a supernova, but simply that this regime has an end. So that's the beauty of this class of dynamics, is that within the dynamics, and that's where the predictability comes in conceptually, is that the dynamics reveals the fact that it has a hand. While an exponential growth, I mean, apart from the finite size of the planet and things like that, there is no end in view. While that's the key issue, the key insight, I would say, a key insight in the predictability provided by this super exponential growth, which indeed led us, and I can reveal that in 1999 with one of my postdocs when I was at UCLA at the time, we were really, as you summarized, seeing the sign of this super exponential growth, and we sold all our holdings and put options and so on. So there were clear warning signs.
You've talked about policymakers. I've seen this in your world, the notion that policymakers, for example, a central bank, their expectations are based on models, processes that often don't contain the full spectrum of possible outcomes. So then the 2008 happens, and they come out and they do a mea culpa and they say, "Oh, we didn't know where this came from." So, but talk specifically in contrast to your work. So they don't have the full spectrum of possible outcomes. I guess my first question is, why is that? And number two, to you, what would be what would be part of that full spectrum that you see that they don't see?
You may remember the chairman of the ECB, European Central Bank, Mr. Trichet, who was in his position at the time of the crisis, famously said in various discourse, communication, and writings that the curse of him and other central bankers was that at the time of the crisis, they felt utterly abandoned by the economic models. They could not rely in anything that was written in the textbooks, anything that was developed by academic researchers. They felt, as he said, quote, abandoned. So that's a vivid way of expressing your point, right? The reason is that the central banks use the so-called dynamical stochastic general equilibrium model, the GE, which assumed away the banks. So it's kind of funny, right, in retrospect, because in this model, the banks are just neutral conduits of economic exchange and credit. They are not model per se, while you remember that the Fed and the Treasury and the old central banks essentially bailed out the banks, which were not existing in the model of the economist. So it's a kind of really a remarkable thing. And the reason you could say, as an auditor, you'd say, well, I mean, these economies are really stupid not to put the banks. I mean, we know how prominent their importance is. But the key insight is that it's not that we just, as an economist, we just assume so with the bank. It's that an economist assumes that the market is extremely well functioning, is therefore converging towards an equilibrium, at which point all the, I would say, negotiation and this positive feedback and this negative feedback, all this anticipation by different economic actors are taken into account at all iterations. So I believe that you believe that, I think that you are going to make this, and so on, at all levels of reflexivity are taken into account in this equilibrium point. So that in the end, you can show that if this is okay, the banks become neutral. The problem and the gap, I would say, as you are asking, is that's my perception, and this is the way the economic profession and the policymakers need to progressively endogenize and work on, is that the real world is not at equilibrium. It looks like an evidence, but it's not so easy actually to treat, and it's very difficult. So, of course, if you realize that the world is out of equilibrium, trying to get equilibrium, to converge to kind of optimal way of functioning, to maximize welfare, well-being, production, and so on. But the world is continuously impacted by surprise. It could be purely exogenous, like a big earthquake, a big tsunami impacting Japan, like in March 2011. It could be, geological. It could be different countries' behavior. It could be social upheaval. It could be, etc. The economy is coupled to all these dynamical system that continuously push it out of equilibrium, trying to get back on its feet and so on. Then you realize that the standard tools do not work. That you need to have better. There is another dimension of the problem. This is how I usually express it to my colleagues, and I try to make it understandable. The first thing that an economist, as a mathematician, because a lot of the economic literature is about developing mathematical models that you can run and fit on the calibrate on the data and so on, make prediction and take decision on it. So these models, the first thing that an economist requires is what is called existence. Existence means that the model has a solution, obviously, and the solution exists forever. You may remember that I mentioned this monstrous concept of a finite time singularity when referring to this return that grow, this super-exponential behavior that is a dynamics that has a hand. It doesn't mean that the universe stops working. It just means that there's a new regime that is going to be something different that is not encapsulated in the bubble, let's say, the super exponential growth. My point is, by imposing that models have solutions that exist for all times, we throw the baby with the bath, meaning we, not I, but other economists, refuse to consider the enormous number of solutions of these models, these economic models, that exhibit this critical time, this TC, at which a transition occurs, like a bubble burst, like, something fundamentally new, a new regime appears. And because they impose this existence, they really become blind to the existence of these solutions.
I've seen in some of your work, some of your writings, you've talked about the contrast, for example, between the efficient market hypothesis and Andrew Lowe's work, the adaptive market hypothesis. As I think about that, and I think about what you just said, there's a group of people that have power and they have control and they have status and they have stature. And there's been many, many decades of theories that they have relied on. I don't think all of that crowd wants to give up their mental place so quickly, do they?
Yeah. I think it was von Neumann, and that famous computer scientist, the founder of the mathematical theory of quantum mechanics as well as computer science, as well as with von Mangerstern, the theory of games, which is a pillar of economic theory. He said, a theory never triumphs, it's only the stupid people who end up dying. Yeah, you have a kind of generation lag delay. By stupid, of course, I don't take that literally. It means that indeed a big problem is, in order to embrace out of equilibrium, dynamical system, complex system view, super exponential, finite time singularity, regime shift, non-linearity, and so on, you need to have the training, the habit of looking at the world in this way. If you have been trained as an economist in the standard, I would say Chicago school way of thinking of things as at things as equilibria, you have a hard time to combine your view of the world with reality. So indeed, that's one of the big issue, big problem. We need to educate the policymakers, and I will go to generalize by saying, and I have a quite strong conviction that one of the big problem for top managers is to have a cognitive appreciation of what their risk manager report to them. If you have been educated as a MBA person, where the business and bottom line is really the objective, you have very little training in statistical analysis, in quantitative analysis. When your risk manager tells you, our company is exposed to that and that risk and so on, and shows you this chart and this technical stuff, this quant stuff and so on, even if you are very clever and so on, I would claim that you are cognitively disconnected. I mean, you cannot endogenize really well what is the message of your risk manager. So I think one of the big gap and the bigger reason of the problem is our top managers and top decision makers are lawyers, are school teachers, or MBAs, have no clue about the quantitative science. So I would, have some influence and power. I would enforce compulsory training in these fields for anyone who has some managerial responsibility.
Yeah, I've had a chance to talk to a lot of pretty successful traders over the years, and risk management is often reduced to a simple heuristic of something to the effect of how much am I willing to lose? And I think that even at a simple level, that type of risk management is far better than the people that just don't even strike open the possibility of loss, because ultimately we have to survive. You have to survive in whatever field we're talking about, whatever discipline it is. You have to be there the next day to play the game. And if you don't survive, you're out.
Yes, so you're opening a Pandora box of question here, which is how do we characterize the risks? And indeed, there's not one single measure of risks. There are many, there are infinitely many, and they are essentially scanning the full spectrum of what we call a risk preference or risk aversion, which is very heterogeneous in the human population also. I'm sympathetic to this view, indeed, that surviving is one important aspect, but in Wall Street, this is not true at all. Winning strategy, and so many banks have played this, and so many hedge funds, so many portfolio managers play this. You just need to get 3-5 years of high returns, taking the maximum risk in a lucky streak, and they get burned. That's not a problem because your bonus and your gains are yours, private, and the losses are public. So this is actually the winning strategy. This is a winning strategy. So it depends which industry you are speaking to. There's also another dimension. So, by the way, this opens the question of to design the incentives so that private and public social incentives are more aligned than they are today, because there is still big conflict in that aspect. But there is another dimension, which is, and I come back to my social bubble hypothesis and the risk taking that you need to take in order to explore this huge universe of innovation and discoveries. If you don't take risk there, you are not going to really advance science. You are not going to advance knowledge. You are not going to get the next, great insight of what is superconductivity or whatever new technology or space science and so on. In this case, there is much more than just survival. I would claim that what makes us humans is that we have evolved from just the focus on surviving, against the mammoth that can stand upon us, or the lion that can saber-tooth tigers that can kill us, and so on, to the transcending of knowledge and wisdom acquisition, right? I would temper a little bit this focus just on survival, saying, yes, it's important. It depends on the industry. You have to take risk, and actually it's beneficial that many take huge risks and fail, not survive, so that there is, as Schumpeter, the famous Austrian economist, was claiming, you have this creative destruction thing that is at work in order to better the industry, the innovation, and so on. So I think there's a trade-off, and there's no, I come back to this, there's no white and black. There's a spectrum that we have to adapt to the type of industry and to our societal goals.
Didier, as we wind down, there's one thing that I've not brought up today that I thought was very clever, and I would love to know some of the background and the process, how it's unfolded. You have what you call the financial bubble experiment. So for those people that are sitting out there right now and you've not had a chance, and I'm sure your models would go far beyond our about an hour conversation, but the notion, people are sitting out there saying, hey, he's just talking. You've created a clever way to lock in your predictions. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm talking because you asked me to talk, Mike. Exactly. I want, as I said, to go out of the armchair talking stance to go things concretely, to go to concrete stuff. Yeah, the question we ask ourselves is, okay, we have all these cases where we did ex post, after the fact analysis of financial crisis, and we had quite nice success. So that's nice to get published in academic journals, but okay, so what for the real world? Then we had this second stage where we would do for a decade in my life, we would do this analysis of ongoing bubbles. We would write a paper, make a report, maybe speak to someone like you, publish it on an international archive in a paper, trying to get it published in advance so that we have, kind of timestamp saying, you see, we diagnosed it before, and then et cetera, et cetera. But of course, this is limited because there are not that many big bubbles in the world at any time. So you have to wait. It's like the problem of earthquake prediction. You have to wait. There is only 1 or 2 magnitude 8 per year in the whole world. So similarly for bubbles, big bubbles. So we came up with this idea: how can we develop an experiment in finance, in physics, in chemistry, in biology? You have this petri dish, you have this laboratory control thing in your lab with special controlled situation and so on. But how do you do this in finance, which is really realistic? So we came up with the following idea of doing this. So collecting data, finding sectors, market sectors, and also in different geographic areas where our tools were indicating the development of a bubble, which in our opinion was not sustainable and would collapse or would change regime. So we would write a report reporting this analysis with, 90, for example, or 80% confidence interval for the time of the transition for that specific market. But we decided not to develop the report immediately for the fear of maybe liability. Also, it's quite a few times when in the past in conferences, in public speech and so on, I report our work. One of the criticisms that I get is, oh, yes, okay, you got it right, but because you said it, you influenced the market. So the crash happened because you predicted it. So you see, it's very difficult to falsify this kind of thing. So of course, when someone tells me this, I say, okay, wow, I'm so powerful. I make markets crash. I did not know that. But coming back to a serious note, so yeah, how do you avoid liability, influencing the market? You have a clean experiment and so on. So we would write these reports. We would hide them for 6 months, but we would publish a report publishing public key with the best hashing technique for encryption, so that everyone, and we would have officially printed the fact that we don't have thousands of reports and we just show the one that have worked, but we have only one repository for our report, which is this international archive, the well-known Cornell University archive, so that 6 months later, we would open our report that was written 6 months earlier, so that everyone can see that indeed this report is uniquely associated with the hashtag, with the encrypted tag that was published 6 months earlier. So there's a kind of notary authentication with modern encryption techniques. And so we carried this over 6 months period as a way indeed to advance the discussion, to show that indeed in the end, the last report, we had 27, if I remember correctly, 27 bubble cases, and I think 24 out of the 27 came out correct. So that was quite a nice thing.
I can only imagine that given the traders and funds around the world, people must be knocking on your door here and there, trying to find out more, right?
Yes. So, already a decade ago, one of my postdoc coded a little program to just see who is downloading our papers. And we were pleasantly surprised at that time that all central banks of the world, all the large banks you can imagine, actually were downloading and reading our papers and so on. So indeed, I would say, when people ask me how is this kind of thinking welcome, I would say in academia, still highly resisted, because there's a kind of inertia, and also there's an issue of framing it in the standard approach that I alluded to. In business, I think it's very well known and many are using it, but it's difficult. It's difficult to implement because what I told. I think I have only outlined and we have discussed the easy part, the concept, but to implement it concretely is difficult, of course. Otherwise it would not be fun, and otherwise it would be too simple. It's difficult because there's so much now in the market. Indeed, the market are close to efficient. There are pockets of predictability, and that's what we are trying to decipher with these bubbles and the super-exponential signatures. Many funds, hedge funds and so on and many private people have contacted me or are often actually reverse engineering what we have been doing because we publish a lot. And, is there something that I learned in finance in banks is that they are very jealous of their proprietary system, so that they would rather redevelop internally than really be dependent on someone else. That's what I've seen a lot. So I know that there are a lot of industry partner people who are using it. And I get often this, what I find very funny message from different professional institutions in various places of the world saying, "Oh, Professor Sornette, you have done this and that, and can you send us your code, please?" Which I find kind of funny.
Hey, let me ask you one last kind of, I wouldn't call it a personal question, but if you can give some personal experience. So you have a pretty extensive physics background, and that's generally different than most people, even, highly educated people. A physics background is a little bit different. Talk about what that foundation has given you later in life, as you now are spending much of your life looking at economic bubbles. Talk about that physics background and what that did for you in the way that you approach the world, the way you think about the world, the way you research, the way you study. Talk some about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I have good and bad things to say about physics. Let me start with the bad things. Descartes, the founder, the French philosopher, founding of Cartesianism, in his Discourse of the Method, says that science is like a tree where the roots are what he called at that time metaphysics, which would be translated nowadays by mathematics probably. And he said the trunk of this tree is physics. And all the branches that come out of this trunk are all the other sciences. So this is, the view of the startup physicist, to see his discipline as the queen or the king of science, from which, everything derives. You have biophysics, you have geophysics, you have, everything is physics, it's applied physics in some sense. This is not my view. So this is the danger of physics. On the other hand, I will elaborate a little bit later on this. On the other hand, physics has the marvelous combination of being quantitative, so striving to develop quantitative models based on the best language that exists, which is mathematics. And mathematics is not nothing but a language, together with the strive to explain the world and being fact-based. So I would say the contrast between physics and economics is that physics try to describe the world as it is, to collect facts, to elaborate on these facts, to imagine, to elaborate hypotheses and models, to run the models, and then to compare the prediction of the models with more evidence that are collected from the reality, from measurement, from running experiment for observations, and continuously improve. And if a model gives a wrong prediction, usually we throw the model away and we try to build a better model. Economics, at the other extreme, strives more to describe the world as it should be, which can be justifiable, because if you think of economics as a discipline that strives to advise policymakers, that's not stupid. That's a good way to think about it. The problem is that there's a big gap between it's kind of a hubris of control or illusion of control, because we think that we can describe the world as it should be, we can make the world as it should be, and that's where the big gap happens, and that's where the big problem that we have been speaking about comes. Yes, what about physics? Being educated as a physicist and as let's say, a theoretical physicist or applied mathematician gives you all these tools that prepares you to think about complexity, out of equilibrium, heterogeneity, past dependence, history dependence, that the equilibrium is a very nice theoretical construct, but is one of many other tools in a global toolbox. So I see myself as someone who has built over all my scientific life an enormous toolbox of concepts and mathematical method that allows me with a very open eye to look at problems and see which one I want to adapt, as opposed, let's say, to the more standard economists who have just a very limited set of tools and just, see nails everywhere because he has just a hammer. Having said that, I want to erase and say that physics is not sufficient. I've become a geology and geophysicist also when I was at UCLA, and it's opened a lot in opportunities. And then I've become a professor of finance, a professor of entrepreneurial risks. And I think really, if there's a message, it's not that physics is best or worse, or economics is best or worse, is that nature does not function in silos. It doesn't function, in disciplines. Just us with our limited mind that we have created these disciplines. The real way is to try to re-synthesize knowledge across disciplines. And this is a trend that, various universities, various people, various institutions are trying to foster. And it's difficult, of course, because it means that you need to be an excellent physicist, an excellent mathematician, an excellent economist, an excellent biologist, and other, in order to aggregate and synthesize a higher level of understanding. But this is the challenge that we need to address for for steering our planet in these times of globalization, of global climate change, maybe of many other challenges of rejuvenating growth, of this runaway population impact on the planet and things like that. So we need this global view. So that's what I have to say about being a physicist.
Didier, I've kept you for too long already. The best place to send people, I'm guessing, would be your university site, ETH Zurich. Is there any other website that another name that we want to send them to, or is that the best place to go?
On my website, I put an enormous amount of resources, media interviews, PowerPoint presentation, all my papers, this financial bubble experiment, and many more.
Yes, you're not an easy guy to prepare for. There's a lot to look over to talk to you on this kind of a conversation in advance. So I shall say to the audience, definitely dig into the website. I think you'll be kept busy for quite a while. Didier, thank you. Hopefully you can come on again in the years to come. I appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much, Mike.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.